On the last Tuesday of October 2023, a suicide prevention volunteer named Claire Ashworth picked up the phone and heard a dead man describe the exact cardigan she was wearing. The green one she'd pulled from the back of her closet that morning for the first time in years. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the number he called from has been physically impossible to dial since 1994, what Claire found when she finally traced the voice back to its source, and why the last thing she wrote in her volunteer log before disappearing was a single sentence. He's been waiting for someone who could actually hear him. Claire Ashworth was 34 years old and tired in the specific way that only comes from caring too much for too long. She had the kind of face that made strangers on trains tell her their problems. Open, patient, slightly sad around the eyes. She'd been volunteering at the Lakeview Crisis Line in Millhaven, Ohio since she was 26, 2 nights a week, every week without exception. The work hollowed her out and filled her back up in equal measure. That's what she told her sister. That's what she believed. The Lakeview Crisis Line operated out of a converted office suite on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled permanently of old carpet and the ghost of someone else's coffee. The fluorescent light above Station 4, Claire's station, had buzzed at a frequency slightly too high since 2019. Nobody had fixed it. You stopped hearing it after 20 minutes. Or you told yourself you did. She worked the late shift, 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. The building's heating system clicked and groaned through the walls like something trying to get comfortable. And outside the single narrow window, the parking lot sat mostly empty under orange sodium lights that turned everything the color of an old bruise. Claire would arrive, hang her coat on the hook beside the door, make tea she rarely finished, and sit down at Station 4 with her headset and her notepad and the particular stillness of someone who has made peace with darkness. The first call came on November 9, 2022. She almost didn't log it properly. That bothers her now, she said so later. It came in at 12:43 a.m., and the line had that underwater quality that sometimes happened with old infrastructure, a faint oscillating hiss beneath the silence, like listening to a seashell. She asked the standard opening. Asterisk, you've reached the Lakeview Crisis Line. My name is Claire. I'm here to listen. Can you tell me your name? Asterisk. The voice that came back was male. Soft. Measured in a way that didn't sound like calm. It sounded like someone who had been past panic so many times they'd worn a path through it. He said his name was Thomas. He said he was standing on a bridge. He said he didn't want anyone to find him because finding him would make it real for someone else. And he'd spent his whole life trying not to make things harder for other people, and he supposed that was part of the problem. Claire talked to Thomas for 2 hours and 19 minutes. She was good at this. She knew how to let silence do the work, when to push gently and when to simply stay, to be a warm body on the other end of a wire, proof that the world contained at least one person who wasn't going anywhere. She'd talked people down before. She would again. But there was something about Thomas's voice that she couldn't locate or name. Something that made the hair on her forearms lift slowly and stay lifted. A frequency just below language. Like the buzzing light. Like something you told yourself you'd stopped hearing. He didn't give her a location. He didn't need to be traced. He stepped back from the edge. She heard it in his voice before he said it. A kind of exhale that changes the entire air pressure of a conversation. He said thank you. He said she was the first person who'd listened without trying to fix him. He said he might call again if that was all right. She said of course. That's what the line was for. What Claire did not know, what she could not have known that night, was that when she asked the system to log the incoming number the way she did with every call, the number that appeared on her screen had an area code that hadn't been active since Millhaven's telecommunications infrastructure was overhauled in 1994. She assumed it was a glitch, a display error. She flagged it in the log and forgot about it by the time she drove home. He called the following night. He called the following night and the night after that, and by the end of the second week, Claire had stopped flagging the number as a glitch. She had started looking forward to it instead. That's the part that unsettled her most when she thought back on it later. Not the impossibility, but the ease with which she had accommodated it. The way Thomas's calls had slid into her nights, the way water finds the lowest ground. Naturally, inevitably, as if they had always been there and she had simply lacked the right instrument to hear them. He called at 12:43 a.m. every time. Not approximately. Not around that hour. The phone at Station 4 would ring at 12:43 a.m. with the precision of something mechanical, something that didn't account for traffic or weather or the small human variables that make a person a minute late or a minute early. The system clock had been logged. Claire had checked 47 calls over the course of those first 2 months, and the timestamp never varied by a single minute. She told herself there was a rational explanation for that too. She was running low on rational explanations, but she kept spending them. The conversations themselves shifted as the weeks accumulated. In the beginning, Thomas had been standing on his bridge. Always the bridge, always that same place. She could hear it in the ambient sound that bled through beneath his voice, the low structural moan of wind moving through cables, the distant suggestion of water far below. But gradually the urgency receded, the way a tide pulls back. He was no longer standing on the railing. He was sitting beside it. Then he was standing on the walkway, facing the rail but not touching it. He told her once, somewhere around the 6th week, that she was the reason for the distance between himself and the edge. He said it without sentiment, the way you'd report a fact about the weather. It hit her harder than gratitude would have. She learned things about him the way you learn a landscape when you walk the same path repeatedly. Not all at once, but in accumulating detail, each visit adding texture to the picture. Thomas had grown up in Millhaven. He had a sister he'd lost touch with. He'd worked for the telephone company once, years ago. Infrastructure, he said, the underground cables, the routing systems, the parts of communication nobody thinks about because they're buried. He laughed quietly when he said that. She noticed he laughed at things with a particular quality of irony that didn't quite reach the surface, like light through deep water. She asked him once what year he'd worked for the telephone company. There was a pause before he answered. A pause of a specific character she would later try to describe to the police detective who interviewed her. Not hesitation exactly, she said. More like a calibration. Like someone choosing which version of the truth would pass through the space between them intact. He said, "Oh, it was a long time ago now. Claire," he said her name softly, the way you'd handle something fragile. And he moved on, and she let him, because in the middle of a night shift at 1 a.m. when the heating system is knocking in the walls and the fluorescent light is humming its one unending note, you develop an instinct for which threads to pull and which to leave. By March, she had mentioned Thomas to her supervisor. Informally, carefully. The supervisor's name was Gerald Hatch, a compact, precise man in his late 50s who'd been managing the Lakeview crisis line for longer than Claire had been alive, and whose face had developed a permanent expression of measured concern the way a cliff face develops its particular shape, through sustained pressure over a very long time. She framed it as a question about protocol. Repeat callers. Long-term engagement. She did not mention the number. She wasn't ready to explain the number out loud to another person, because she understood, somewhere beneath language, that saying it aloud would change its status from anomaly to something she would be required to act on. Gerald told her repeat callers were common. He told her the important thing was maintaining appropriate boundaries. He told her she was doing exactly the right thing. He said this looking directly at her, and she noticed he hadn't asked for the caller's name, and she noticed she hadn't offered it, and she noticed they both seemed to prefer it that way, and she went home and sat in her car in her own driveway for 11 minutes without turning off the engine. In April, she started researching the number herself. She did it the way you do something you're slightly ashamed of. Late at night, alone, in the particular silence of a house where no one else is sleeping. She typed the area code into a telecommunications history archive she'd found through 2 hours of searching, and what she found confirmed what some still functioning part of her brain had already accepted without permission. The area code belonged to a prefix block that had been retired in Millhaven's 1994 infrastructure overhaul. The specific exchange, the first 3 digits following the area code, had been assigned to a single telephone substation on Renner Street. She found a digitized record from the Millhaven Courier, dated September 16, 1994, that described the substation's decommissioning as part of a citywide modernization project. There was a photograph accompanying the article. A squat brick building, parking lot, a utility door propped open with what looked like a toolbox. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she scrolled down and found a second article, dated 4 days later, September 20, 1994. This one was shorter. The headline was small and placed below the fold, the way papers used to bury stories they weren't sure what to do with. It was about a man found dead near the Millhaven River Bridge. a telephone company worker. He'd been identified from his work badge. He had no next of kin that could be reached. The article was 11 sentences long. His name appeared in the 4th sentence. Thomas Vale, 34 years old. Claire sat with that for a very long time. She went back to her volunteer log. She counted the calls. She looked at the timestamps. She looked at what she'd written about his voice, his pauses, his particular brand of quiet, and she thought about the way he said her name like something that needed to be protected from the air. She kept picking up the phone. This is the part that people struggle with when they hear this story. Why didn't she stop? Why didn't she escalate it, report it, step away? And the only answer, the honest one, is that Thomas was stepping further from the edge with every call. Whatever was happening, whatever Claire was participating in, it was working. He was getting better. Or becoming something better. She wasn't certain those were the same thing anymore. But she kept going because stopping felt like dropping someone, and Claire Ashworth had spent 8 years learning how to not drop people. By August, he was no longer on the bridge at all. He would call and he would talk about the river, about the way the city sounded at night, about what he remembered of his life in Millhaven in tones that were almost peaceful. She had started to believe. She has never entirely forgiven herself for this, that whatever Thomas was, he was healing, that she was doing something genuinely good inside a situation she didn't understand. And then came the last Tuesday of October 2023. She pulled the green cardigan from the back of her closet that morning because the temperature had dropped sharply overnight and it was the warmest thing she could find quickly. And she hadn't worn it in years because it had belonged to her mother and it still smelled faintly of her mother. And she'd put it on anyway because grief becomes practical eventually. She drove to the Lakeview crisis line. She hung her coat on the hook. She sat at Station 4. She waited. At 12:43 a.m., the phone rang. She picked up. She said her opening. Thomas said her name. And then he said, "Asterisk, you're wearing green tonight. That cardigan suits you, Claire. The shade of it. You should wear it more often." Asterisk. The fluorescent light hummed above her. The heating system knocked inside the wall. Outside, the sodium lights turned the parking lot the color of an old bruise. She did not ask how he knew. She understood in that moment that asking would be a formality. That something had shifted in the architecture of whatever this was. That for a year she had believed she was reaching through the dark toward Thomas, offering him a tether. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found when she looked up from her notepad and realized she had never once stopped to consider who was holding the other end. She looked at the call log on her screen. The number glowed back at her. The dead exchange. The 1994 prefix. And beneath it, in the field that the system automatically populated with call location data when it could be determined, a field that had always been blank for Thomas's calls every single time for an entire year, there was an address. 4410 Renner Street. The decommissioned substation. The brick building from the newspaper photograph. The one that had been sealed and forgotten for 29 years. And in the metadata window beside the address, in the small secondary field that logged whether a location had been flagged by the system before, the field that recorded prior call history from a given site, there were 1,147 previous entries, going back to 1994, all of them from the same address, all of them on the same line. And as Claire scrolled up through the names of the volunteers who had taken those calls, across 3 decades, across staff she had never met and some she had, her fingers stopped at a name logged on a November night in 2004, a volunteer named Andrea Souza, who had documented a repeat caller named Thomas, who had noted in her final log entry, on the last night she ever worked the Lakeview crisis line, that she believed the caller had become aware of her specifically, that he was describing details about her that she had not shared. Andrea Souza had never come back for her next shift. Her supervisor at the time had noted she resigned without contact. No forwarding information, no explanation. Claire's hand was very cold. She looked at her own name in the current log. She looked at the date. And she looked at the small authentication field at the top of each entry, the field that recorded whether a volunteer's credentials were active and current. And she noticed for the first time that her own field had stopped updating. The timestamp beside her name had not changed since last Tuesday, since the moment she'd arrived for her shift, since the moment she had sat down at Station 4 and hung up her coat and made tea she would not finish, and felt, in some unlocatable way, that she had finally arrived somewhere she had been traveling toward for a very long time. The phone was still in her hand. Thomas was still on the line. And into the long, breathing silence between them, he said very gently, "You understand now, don't you, Claire?" It wasn't a question. She didn't answer him right away. That detail matters. In the months that would follow, in the reconstruction pieced together from Claire's volunteer log, from the system metadata, from the police report that was eventually filed and eventually closed with the designation inconclusive stamped across it in red ink that someone had pressed too hard, that pause would be the thing investigators kept returning to. The space between Thomas's not question and whatever came after it. Because in that pause, something happened that no metadata could record. Claire Ashworth understood the complete shape of where she was. She understood it the way you understand a room when someone finally turns on the light. Not as new information exactly, but as the confirmation of something your body already knew, had been whispering to you through cold hands and lifted forearm hairs and tea you never finished and a timestamp that had stopped moving. The fluorescent light hummed. The heating system knocked. She could smell her mother's cardigan, that particular blend of cedar and something floral and something underneath that was just the smell of a person who was gone. And she breathed it in, and she thought about the 1,147 calls that had come from 4410 Renner Street before hers. She thought about Andrea Souza, who had packed up and vanished from her life in November 2004 without a forwarding address or an explanation. She thought about whether vanished was the right word, or whether it was a word she'd chosen because the alternative required her to look directly at something she had been keeping in her peripheral vision for a year. She thought about Thomas Vale, 34 years old, found near the Millhaven River Bridge on September 20, 1994. 11 sentences in a newspaper that hadn't known what to do with him. No next of kin that could be reached. She thought about what it means to stand on a bridge and not have a single person in the world who would be made real by finding you. She thought about the fact that she was 34 years old. The phone was warm against her ear. Thomas was still there. She could hear him breathing, or something that moved through the line the way breathing would, that occupied the same space in her ear that breathing would, close and patient and unhurried, like someone who had learned that time moved differently than he'd once believed. She said, "How long have you been calling?" He said, long enough to understand that most people can't hear me. Not really. They hear sound. They respond to it. But you. He paused. And in the pause she heard the low structural moan she'd been listening to for a year, the deep cable tension sound of his bridge, and she understood now that what she'd been hearing was not a bridge at all. Not anymore. It was something else. It was the sound of a frequency that had been looking for a receiver for 29 years. "You actually hear me, Claire." She closed her eyes. The fluorescent light hummed its one unending note. She said, Thomas. "I need you to hear me now." A silence. The particular quality of silence she'd come to know as his attention fully given, that held breath quality, that water pressure stillness. She said, "You called because you didn't want to be alone at the edge. And I've been here. I've been here every night. And I think, her voice was steady. Surprised her. I think something in you already knows that you stepped back. A long time ago. I think the reason the calls started changing back in August, back when you stopped talking about the bridge and started talking about the city, about what you remembered, I think that's because part of you has been trying to tell yourself it's all right to go. The sound from the line shifted. That deep, structural moan softened. Just slightly, like tension releasing from a cable. She said, "You've been waiting for someone who could actually hear you. That's what you told the others, all of them, all the way back to 1994. You kept calling because you needed someone to hear you, really hear you, before you could let go. And I hear you, Thomas. I have heard you. Every single night for a year. You are not the 11 sentences in that article. You are not the badge they used to identify you. You are the man who spent his whole life trying not to make things harder for other people, and I am telling you now clearly so it passes through." Her voice caught once, briefly, like a flame in a draft. You can stop. You're allowed to stop. The line went quiet. Not the quiet of a call dropped or a connection failed. Not the empty hiss of dead infrastructure. A different kind of quiet, the kind that fills a room after something long and difficult has been said and received. The kind that is not absence but presence, the specific fullness of a silence that follows completion. She heard him exhale. It was the same exhale she had learned to listen for across 8 years of crisis work. The one that changes the entire air pressure of a conversation. The one that means a person has stepped back. Except this time it didn't end with "I'll call again if that's all right." This time it ended with nothing, and the nothing was gentle, and it spread through the line and through her headset and into the small bones of her ear, and somewhere in the orange bruise parking lot of a building that smelled of old carpet and someone else's coffee. The fluorescent light above Station 4 buzzed once, sharply, and went out. The backup light blinked on from across the room. Cooler. Dimmer. Different. Claire sat in the changed light for a long time. When she finally looked at her screen, the call log was still there. The timestamp was still there. Her authentication field, the one that had stopped updating, was blinking now, slowly, the way a system blinks when it's reconciling a record, filling in the gap between what was logged and what is current. By the time it finished, the entry had updated. Her credentials showed as active. The timestamp moved forward. The number in the call log had changed. Where the dead 1994 exchange had glowed for a year, there was now nothing. A blank field. As though the number had never resolved at all, as though it had always been a kind of interference pattern, a signal looking for somewhere to land, and now it had nowhere left to go. She sat for a while longer. The heating system had gone quiet inside the walls. She hadn't noticed when that happened. Then she opened her volunteer log. She thought for a long time about what to write. She thought about protocols and reports and what could be explained and what could not. About Gerald Hatch's measured face and the detective who would later sit across from her in a room with bad coffee and ask her to please explain the part about the number again. She thought about Andrea Souza wherever she was, and she chose to believe she was somewhere, that she had gone somewhere. That vanished was in fact the wrong word, and what had happened was simply that Andrea had reached the edge of something she couldn't explain and had stepped back from her own life rather than try to account for it. Claire understood that impulse completely. She had spent a year right beside it. She wrote one sentence in the log. He's been waiting for someone who could actually hear him. She closed the log. She took off her headset. She picked up her cold cup of tea, took one sip and put it back down. She stood. She lifted her coat from the hook beside the door. She put it on over the green cardigan that had belonged to her mother. And she noticed that the cardigan no longer smelled of cedar and something floral and something underneath that was just the smell of a person who was gone. It smelled like her now. She turned off the light at Station 4, what was left of it, the backup light, the cooler one, and she walked down the hall and took the elevator to the lobby and pushed through the glass door into the cold Ohio night. The parking lot was empty. The sodium lights turned the asphalt the color of an old bruise. She stood there for a moment, looking at the building, looking at the third-floor window that had gone dark, and she felt, despite everything, inside all of it, underneath the cold and the strangeness and the year of accumulating dread, something she didn't have a clinical word for, a kind of completion, the feeling of a frequency finally going quiet, not because it was cut off, but because it found what it was reaching for. She thought about what it means to spend a life trying not to make things harder for other people. She thought about a man who had carried that weight to a bridge in 1994 and never had a single voice tell him it was enough. That he was enough. She thought about the fact that 8 years of sitting in the dark and listening, really listening, not fixing, not advising, just staying, had been building toward a moment that no protocol covered and no training had prepared her for, and she had done it anyway, and it had mattered even across whatever distance separated a night in 2023 from a night in 1994. Maybe especially across that distance. She got into her car. She sat for a moment. She did not check her phone. She did not call her sister, not yet. She just sat inside the quiet that Thomas had left behind, which was not an absence but a kind of gift, and she let it be there with her, and eventually she started the engine, and she drove home through the orange-lit streets of Millhaven, and the cardigan kept her warm the whole way. The Lakeview Crisis Line never received another call from 4410 Renner Street. The building at 4410 Renner Street was demolished for a mixed-use development in early 2024. Workers clearing the site reported that the substation's telephone infrastructure, cables, junction boxes, relay panels, was in a state of decay consistent with 30 years of disuse. Everything was corroded. Everything had been dead for decades, except for one telephone line inside the east wall cavity, which workers described as showing no corrosion at all. as though it had been in active use until very recently. The foreman photographed it. He wasn't sure why. He said later it just seemed like the kind of thing that needed to be recorded. Nobody ever explained it satisfactorily. Some things resist satisfactory explanation, and perhaps that's not a failure of understanding but simply an accurate reflection of the depth of certain things. The depth of loneliness, the depth of the need to be heard, the depth of what it means to stay present with someone at the edge of themselves, in the dark at 12:43 in the morning, for as long as it takes. Claire still volunteers at the Lakeview Crisis Line. Station 4. Late shift. The fluorescent light was finally replaced in November 2023, and the new one makes no sound at all, and sometimes in the silence between calls she finds herself listening for it anyway. For that high, familiar hum, and she isn't sure whether what she feels in its absence is relief or something closer to grief. She picks up every call. Every week, Mindshift Stories brings you the cases that keep investigators awake at night, the ones too disturbing for mainstream media. If that sounds like something you need, subscribe now and never miss a story.